President Trump will sign several executive orders in the Oval Office around noon today, and we have learned that it appears he could be invoking the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. The president saying this would pave the way for faster mass deportations of those in the country illegally, and he campaigned on invoking that wartime law. The law has been invoked 3 times during major conflicts. That includes the War of 1812, World War I, and World War II. But there are a lot of questions about exactly what this is. So as we've been gathering this information, I did want to bring in John Sandweg, the former director of ICE and former acting general counsel at the Department of Homeland Security. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us and help discuss this.
Yeah, my pleasure. Glad to be here.
Of course. Well, first off, I do want to ask you, because folks out there have heard a lot about this over the last several hours. Can you explain exactly what the Alien Enemies Act is for folks out there watching?
Sure. It's a law that was passed by Congress in 1798, of course, that would give the president an authority during wartime if there's a foreign invasion or incursion into the United States to detain and deport or expel from the United States individuals without, bypassing any sort of courts, without giving them due process of law. And so what the president is now trying to do is invoke that in the context of our current immigration situation, because the biggest impediment, Josh, he faces for the mass deportation plan are these backlogged immigration courts and the fact that most of the undocumented migrants in the United States are required to see an immigration judge and have a deportation hearing before they can be removed. So in order to bypass that, what the president has been talking about since the campaign is invoking this Alien Enemies Act, which he would argue gives them the unilateral authority to detain certain migrants and then just deport them without that hearing.
Has this ever been used in connection with immigration? As we mentioned, it's only been used 3 times in the past. So is this going to be a first?
Certainly going to be the first time, that was used outside of the context of a declared war. The 2 most, famous examples are during World War I and, of course, during World War II with the internment camps of Japanese, including U.S. citizens. It has never been used in domestic immigration enforcement like we're seeing today. And, of course, that is going to be the primary crux of these legal challenges, which, lawyers are going to argue that, in fact, the authority can only be invoked when there's a declared war or a foreign government-sponsored invasion of the United States, and that this mass migration doesn't constitute a government-backed incursion into the U.S.
You kind of just discussed this, but I imagine this is going to face some legal challenges. Can you talk a little bit more about what we can expect in the coming days, weeks, months, as he is expected to sign that executive order today at noon, as he signed several other orders?
Yeah, Josh, and first, I guess to begin with, the legal challenge will be predicated in part on the scoping of the order. One thing we don't know is exactly who this is going to apply to. Various media reports out there suggest the president's going to limit the scope to transnational gang members. And that's important because the legal arguments are going to hinge upon whether or not this constitutes an invasion of the United States or an incursion. But again, let's say the president says that I'm going to apply Alien Enemies Acts to transnational gang members. I absolutely, obviously, given, as we see with everything involving immigration, it's going to trigger lawsuits and it's going to be decided by the federal courts. In terms of those, what's interesting about this, though, is that this is an authority that draws upon the president's power as the commander-in-chief. And typically, courts are more reluctant to question the president's decisions when it comes to those national security, foreign policy, and commander-in-chief authorities that the president has. And so I think, although a lot of people arguably, and probably correctly would assert that, this is obviously a very unprecedented use of Alien Enemies Act, and it's not a declared war or that kind of formal invasion that Congress probably envisioned when it passed the law. You run up against this counter argument of, well, it's not for the courts to second guess the president of the United States in terms of deciding when the U.S. is under attack or deciding what we need from foreign policy. So I think that this court battle will be very interesting as it plays out. But of course, as I said at the outset, it all really depends on the scope of this. How broadly will this apply to the undocumented population in the United States?
And I want to get your take as the former director there of ICE. How have we seen the number of people entering the U.S. illegally change over the past several weeks and months since President Trump took office?
Yeah, we have a completely different border today, Josh, than we did 6 months ago, and really, especially 12 months ago. This all began, to be fair, with the Biden administration, who in June of last year made modifications to our asylum law that basically eliminated access to the immigration courts and the asylum system for people crossing the border illegally. As a result of that, you started seeing a tremendous drop in the number of people, pretty steadily dropped from June when he invoked that order until January. It's accelerated even further under President Trump by his rhetoric, by the deploying of the military to the border, and in these additional actions he's taken. It has created a chilling effect that's deterred migrants from even trying. So we're hearing reports of large numbers of migrants who had made their way to Mexico and are now turning around and heading back south. So today we're looking at something like really record lows at the border. All of that, interestingly enough, Josh, kind of plays into these legal questions as well. The president's argument was when we were facing the time when we had 200,000 people crossing that border in January of last year compared to 8,000 today, you could make a better argument that constituted a quote unquote invasion. But it does make it his success at the border, ironically, makes it harder for him to defend the invocation of alien enemies, because it's hard to say we're facing an invasion when we're at record lows at the actual border itself.
John Sandweg, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. We are following the developments here, and we appreciate you helping to break it down. Is there anything else you want to add about the situation in general here before I let you go?
I think, Josh, very quickly, the only thing I would add is, again, if you look at the mass deportation plan here, the president needs to first increase the number of arrests. But all those arrests, the real challenge it faces are those backlogs in the immigration court, where it can take 3 to 5 years for people to, go through the immigration court process and be legally, where the administration is legally able to deport them. So this is part of a larger effort he has to bypass the immigration courts. But in terms of if it's narrowed in scope as we envision, it's not going to make a substantial impact because there just aren't that many gang members. You can't deport 1 million people a year under this, if it's a narrow invocation. So a lot more to come, Josh, and it'll be interesting to see how this plays out in the courts.
It definitely will be. That executive order expected to be signed at noon today. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us here. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.